Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ and today we are going to be talking all about the detachment system. Detachments are a bit of a funny one because I've been wanting to do a video about the detachment system for a little while now, but I just haven't quite been able to articulate it, and now that we've had 9th edition for a little while and we've seen how they've changed from 8th to 9th, I think it's a good time to talk about it and a good time just to reflect on what we have gained, what we have lost and how we use them. And for today we're going to be painting this model right here. Nice model, I think. Cool, so without further ado, let's crack on. The most curious thing about the detachments is that they've been around for a bit longer now than most people fully realise. If we go back to the era of 6th and 7th edition, many of the codexes started to see variations on the traditional 1HQ and 2 troop choice core force organisation chart, as it was known then. The Space Wolves, the Blood Angels and the Orcs all had minor variations within their own codexes on this and were able to use different force organisations, albeit very minor changes to those force organisations. They weren't the way they are now, with many different detachment systems working in tandem with each other. It was still very much one force organisation chart and that's it. Arguably, the Allies was also the first real variation back in 6th edition, but obviously this was less influential as the way of taking Allies has changed quite a lot over the years. But then we also think about the formations from 7th edition, when you could have things like demi-companies or the First Company with Space Marines and the Necron Decurions. These were all variations on the old way of taking your army and organising your army. The only difference between those ones as they were then and the way they are now is that those were fixed formations. You could only have set units and set models. Very similar to the battalion system in Age of Sigmar that is being used now, and in fact the Age of Sigmar battalion system is pretty much a carbon copy of that old way of doing things and has been brought over to Age of Sigmar from 40k. But that then obviously raises the question of what changed, what happened? Now, obviously, I think a lot of it came down to what I was saying in my 8th and 9th edition video. It was removing the limitations that the players were faced with in the game. And the detachment systems, in many ways, were very restrictive. The force organisation chart was a very fixed thing and it hadn't changed in most of 40k. And as a result, every army was structured exactly the same. Again, this is something else I said in my 8th and 9th edition video, why they're better than the previous editions. But we're getting distracted. The fact is that when every army was organised exactly the same way, even if not with the same models, it meant many of the armies' differences were only cosmetic, and when you get right down to it, one character and 2 troops for a Space Marine, Eldar, Dark Eldar, Orc, Tyrannid, or whoever army, if everyone's coming together with the same organisation, every army is going to start to play in a very similar manner. So when we come forward to 8th and 9th edition, it was a huge change, massive, and much bigger than I think people realise even now. When we think about the 8th edition detachments, the encouragement was there to take more detachments because of the command points, for one thing, but there was 2 other things that came into it. Command points was obviously the first big one, but there's a second point that came in that's far more important to consider, and that was objective secured. Now, objective secured is obviously a very important thing in just about any matched play army, and certainly in any tournament or competitive play. If you want to take an army, you're going to want as many units as possible to have the objective secured rule. Now, at time of recording, the majority of units that have it are largely troop units, and there are some characters that can have it with certain warlord traits and certain stratagems, but those are a minority, and because there's so few of them, they don't really factor into most people's list building and aren't really something that you can automatically jump onto as an option for inclusion in your army. But with 8th edition, it was definitely there. But when you were having multiple detachments, and obviously back then to use stratagems, you had to have more detachments because you weren't getting as many command points in your army as you do now by default. A lot of it came down to you needing to have 2 or 3 detachments in order to get as many command points as you do now. And also, there wasn't the same limitation on detachments to the same extent as there is now. You can still have 2 or 3 detachments in an army that's between 1,500 and 2,000 points. Back then, you could still have more until eventually it was FAQ'd and the limitations were placed on there. So you didn't have wild detachment or wild numbers of detachments within each of the armies. Now, this is all very recent history, and the majority of you listening probably know this already, but I just want to put this into context as to when we then shifted to 9th edition. Suddenly, the emphasis and the encouragement to take multiple detachments was in many ways removed. You had to spend command points that you wanted to spend on your stratagems in-game to get more detachments, rather than having detachments that you would have to make up the core of your army. And the other thing to remember is that the majority of armies never really benefited from having multiple detachments within their army list itself. The only arguable exception was the Drakari, who had it for their having multiple patrol detachments. But that only really worked because of the structures of the 3 types of regiment/chapter they had, which was the Witch Cult, the Warrior Cabal, and the Homunculi Coven. A lot of C's in there, but that's just the way it works. But with them as well, that has changed too. Even though you will see multiple detachments of Drakari, probably in their next codex when it comes out eventually, will have a massive change to that rule, but they're the only ones who even now still get any real benefit out of having multiple detachments, whereas virtually every other army, they maximise command points by having as few detachments as possible. So this then leads to the next question. In 9th edition, what is the actual benefit of having multiple detachments? Well, the answer may surprise you a little bit. Having multiple detachments does cost you command points, yes, but first thing to say about that is you don't need as many command points as you might possibly think, and on top of that, command points aren't the game winners that people think they are when it comes to using stratagems. Most people say this again and again. You can have 6, maybe 7 command points in your army, and that's all you'll need to use all the stratagems you want at the right times. You don't need to have an excess of 10 command points to have a competitively sound army, or an army that's still capable of doing most things. And the other thing to say on stratagems is I personally do feel that because they're still quite new, and a lot of them do seem very powerful on paper, but many of them are very situational, and a lot of them don't necessarily have the guaranteed impact that you're going to want them to have in-game. A lot of them are just buffs or rerolls or putting up mortal wounds. They aren't the game changers that people think they are. More often than not, all they do is enhance what's already there, but if you know how to play your army, you can probably get a very similar result just by playing well. Now, I don't mean to sound condescending, I just mean to say if you want to make your army work, you're going to have to put more work into the list than you're going to put into spending command points. But to get back on point as to why they aren't the biggest factor, is that when you have multiple detachments, it gives you a much broader accessibility to your army when it's on the board. Now, the obvious ones which everyone goes for are the patrol, battalion, and brigade detachment, simply because they're the ones that most comfortably fit in to our, in many ways, pre-existing ideas to how to structure our armies. And going back to that idea of objective secured, only troops units have objectives secured, so you're going to want to have detachments where you are going to be maximising the number of units that have that role. But if you look over to the other ones, you will see that you can have troop units in most of the other detachments. The only ones you can't really have it in are the Supreme Command and the Super Heavies. But to be fair, if you're taking one of those 2 detachments anyway, you're probably going to be putting a few things in your army that are going to let you have objectives secured on what's going to be in that army anyway, so that doesn't really hold up as an argument in my opinion. By looking at your army in a different light, battalion, detachment, brigade detachment, and patrol detachment, what you'll start to see is a very different way to play with your armies. Now, depending on how much you've actually built your army and bought your models around your army list will vary greatly. But many of us have units that we think of very much as auto takes and units we leave off to one side because they're harder to find ways to factor in. When you do start taking multiple detachments, so the patrol detachment and the spearhead detachment, or the patrol detachment and the vanguard detachment, you start to see very different options at play in your army, and you find yourself able to do different things. Suddenly your army becomes far more tank heavy or big gun heavy, for example, or it becomes far more elites focused, or it becomes far more fast attack focused. And when you put all that into consideration and you start putting all that into your army list, you'll see a very different way of playing, because you're putting the emphasis on your non-objective secure units in sharper relief, and you'll be more open to seeing what they can do. If your army does focus primarily on fast attack or heavy support units, this is actually quite a good way to find out what combinations of those work best in tandem with each other, whilst keeping a solid core of units that you can go after if you're playing in a more match play or competitive style. And what it also does is that it frees you up a little bit. You're less reliant and thinking in a very fixed way of here's the detachments I'm going to use and that's it. You're actually more open and more free and more able to use the detachments in more ways to experiment with how your army interlocks with itself, how it synergizes, and how it changes its overall play. And I've often found that this will help you lead to a change in your playstyle inadvertently as well. You won't be playing with your army exactly the same as you were when it was all either in one detachment or just fixed detachments as it was before. But to go back to the argument of where's the benefit from it again, this is where this argument really does come into its own. The real benefit of taking multiple detachments or changing up your army around the detachment system is that it really does allow you to look at your army differently. You won't look at it the same way as if you're trying to fit everything into one detachment, because that's the word there. You're fitting everything in. You're having to cut things off, or you're having to minimize certain things in order to fit everything into the one detachment you have. The moment you expand into multiple detachments, that problem goes away and you find yourself with more access to more things across the entire board. Now, if you look very closely at how most of the detachments read as well, there's the very obvious ones where you're taking multiples of fast attack, heavy support, and elites units, and that's all fine. But then you have to remember that when you take things like the Supreme Command in tandem with the Patrol Detachment, you've suddenly got a very big core unit of heroes alongside your other units. And that's very interesting to think about how that works when you start playing it in both competitive and more friendly games. You're not just thinking of, here's how I get all my army onto the board and moving it across. You're going, here's my select characters, what can I do with them? And that creates a whole new different way of playing, and quite an interesting way of playing as well, on that note as well. So that's my thing when it comes to the detachment system. You don't need to worry about the command points. It's often about trying to do new things with your army, find new ways to play with it, but also being able to diversify the range you do have, and it may make you want to acquire more models for your army because there'll be more accessibility in using it and finding other ways to play with it once you've actually got it. But I leave it to you. Tell me what you think. Do you think the detachment system itself maybe needs an overhaul, or should it be simplified back into what it is before? Do you think there's more that can be made from the detachment system? And do you think there are other armies specifically that will benefit from it more than others? I also know at the same time that the Imperial Guard do have the thing where if you take a spear detachment, all the Leman Russes get objectives secured. I do know that, so I'm just going to put that out there now, but I forgot to mention it earlier. But in any case, let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So, that's my thoughts on the detachment system. I hope you found that interesting and useful and informative, and let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with what I said about the detachment system? Do you have other things you want to say about the detachment system? Are there things I missed about the detachments that you think are worth saying as well? If so, please comment below, and while you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I try to post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays now, as hopefully you guys all know. That might change a little bit, but for now that's probably what I'm going to be sticking to. And make sure to get onto my website and onto the Instagram to register your interest for a model. Every time I hit that 50 subscribers, there's going to be a giveaway, so you could be in with a chance to win one of the models you've seen painted here, or something else entirely, who knows. But in any case, thank you all very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.